They were already saying he would sicken before the snow flew, and the man was building a house on top of a manure pile. In the summer of 1885, near a hard little settlement called Harlow Bend out on the Dakota Plains, Silas Verren spent the warm months digging a pit and filling it with dung, not raising a cabin where a cabin should be, though. He dug a deep double pit down into a low rise, and then, instead of moving into a plain dry room the way any sensible homesteader would, he hauled load after load of fresh horse and cow manure and wet straw, and spent stable bedding down into the lower chamber and packed it hard and damp, layer over layer, and then floored a small living room in heavy plank directly above the buried heap. The whole settlement laughed. Winter was coming the way it always came to that country, mean and early and long, and every other homesteader for 20 miles was chinking a log cabin tight or squaring off an honest dirt dugout, and here was Silas Verren shoveling manure into a hole and building his bed over it, like a stable hand too low and too broke to raise a real house. He would sicken in the reek of it or freeze in the wet by the first hard blow, they said, buried in a hovel he had built on a horse-turd. What none of them knew, and what the killing winter would teach them, was that Silas Verren had read the cold and the heap better than any man in Harlow Bend, and had buried under that plank floor the one fire that would never go out. He had come to that country carrying more grief than goods. He had been a livery stable hand and a freight teamster back in the settled country to the east, a lean, close-mouthed man who had spent his working life among horses and harness and the steaming heaps of a stable yard, and who knew manure and its heat the way another man knows leather or iron. He had run a livery barn with his wife those long years, the two of them keeping horses for the town and hauling freight and living quiet, and the winter before, a bad fever had taken her in a single hard week while the snow lay deep and no doctor could get through. Something in Silas Verren went quiet after that and did not come loud again. He loaded a wagon with what was left him, his harness and his tools, and a good team, and went west, as far from the empty barn as a man could get, and came onto a cheap quarter section at Harlow Bend in the Dakota Territory in May with a dog that followed the wagon, and a way of thinking about heat and dung and the ground that no other homesteader in the settlement would ever have guessed. For Silas Verren had spent his whole working life learning one plain fact that the whole of his strange house would be built upon, and the settlers around him had never once stopped to think it through. He had learned it in the stable yard in the dead of a dozen winters, and it was this, that a heap of manure makes its own heat and makes it for months, and makes it in the hardest cold there is. Any liveryman knows it who has ever laid a bare hand into the heart of a well-built dung heap on a January morning and felt it warm as a banked stove clean down at the center while the snow lay all around it. Dung and wet straw, packed deep and damp and left to itself, does not merely sit there, it works. It ferments, it rots in a slow, steady burn. And that rotting throws a real and lasting heat that will steam a stable yard heap through the whole of a plains winter and thaw the frost for a foot around it. And it had come to Silas Verren in the long quiet after the fever that a heat like that, a heat that needed no wood and no match and no tending, and would burn for months on its own, was a heat a freezing man might live on if only he could catch it and hold it and lead it into a room. And Silas Verren, who had spent a lifetime building and turning and reading the heaps in a stable yard, knew exactly what a heap needed to hold that heat and what killed it. For the heat was not automatic, and this was the part no one in Harlow Bend understood at all. A thin scattering of manure flung loose across a yard does not warm anything. It freezes hard and dead as a stone by December, the cold reaching all through it and the little heat it makes lost to the open air before it can build. What makes the heat is mass and packing and damp and shelter. A heap must be deep, so its own bulk holds a warm heart the cold cannot reach. It must be packed tight and kept damp, for the slow rot lives on wet and dies out dry, and it must be sheltered and capped against the frost, so the heat is not stripped off the top as fast as it rises. Build the heap deep and dense and wet and covered, and it becomes a slow furnace that burns for months. Leave it thin and loose and open, and it dies. Every liveryman half knew that a big heap steamed, but only a man who had truly studied them knew that the depth and the packing and the damp and the cap were the whole of it, and that a heap built underground in a deep pit sealed under a floor would be the deepest, densest, best sheltered heap a man could make, a furnace that never went out. So it came to Silas Verren that if he dug a deep pit and packed it tight with fresh manure and wet bedding and capped it and floored a room straight over the top of it, he would have a fire under his feet all winter that asked for nothing. No wood, no match, no tending. A slow, steady heat rising up through the plank floor while the killing cold spent itself harmless on the frozen ground above. The heap would give the heat, the depth in the packing, and the damp and the cap would keep it. Where the plain dugout men and the cabin builders would spend all winter feeding a hungry stove and still lose their warmth to every draught, Silas Verren meant to bury a furnace that fed itself. It was, though he had never heard the words and never would, a compost-heated shelter. A room warmed from below by the slow biological burn of a buried, packed, sealed heap, and he set out that May to build one in the side of a Dakota rise. He began, to the settlement's mild approval, by digging what looked at first like an honest root cellar. Through May and into June, Silas Verren dug his deep double pit down into the low rise, squaring a lower chamber underneath and a living room above it, setting stout posts and a heavy ridge of poles, and the homesteaders who rode by nodded to see it, for a man wanting a good deep cellar under his floor was only being provident. Then he did the thing that turned the nods to laughter. Instead of leaving the lower chamber clean and dry for potatoes and turnips like a sane man, he backed his wagon up to it and began to haul manure. He carted off from every stable yard and cattle pen for miles what other men were glad to be rid of, load after reeking load of horse dung and cow dung and old wet straw and spent stall bedding, and he layered it down into the lower chamber and tramped it and packed it hard and wetted it and packed it again, building the buried heap deep and dense the way a lifetime in the stable yard had taught him. When a neighbor asked him what he was doing filling a good cellar with dung, Silas said only that a packed heap burns warm all winter and a man might as well sleep over the fire, and the neighbor rode off shaking his head. All through June and into July he built his heap, hauling and layering and packing and damping, capping the top with a tamped layer of earth and straw, and then laying his heavy plank floor across the whole of it. His good cellar became a dung pit, and the laughter grew with every load. The work of it was long and low and stinking, and it made the mockery worse, because from the road it looked like nothing but a broken man moving into a manure heap, the smell of the heap hanging over his place through the hot months so that folks a mile off knew what the stable hand was about. And all the while the sensible thing lay right there in plain sight. Floor an honest dry cellar and raise a proper room and be done, the way any homesteader would. And Silas Verren turned his back on the clean finish every day to haul another load of dung and pack it deeper. When a man riding by said a house was meant to sit on good, clean ground and not on a pile of filth, Silas answered that clean ground was cold ground and would freeze a man all winter, and that his pile of filth would be throwing heat come January when their clean ground was hard as iron. And the man rode off certain the stable hand had lost his reason along with his wife. Silas Verren knew exactly why he packed every load of that heap deep and tight and damp, and there was not another soul in Harlow Bend who could have told you. The laughter had a leader, and his name was Josiah Crale. Crale was a grain farmer grown prosperous, a big, loud, broad-handed man who ran the most ground of anyone near the bend, held the big frame house up on the section line, and liked everyone to know that a man got on in this world by doing the plain thing well and keeping himself clean and decent while he did it. He had watched Silas Verren dig what looked like an honest cellar and grunted his approval. Then he had watched the man spend a whole summer filling it with dung and moving in over the top, and something in Josiah Crale took it as a personal affront, as if the broken stable hand were making a mock of honest homesteading itself. So Crale led the laughter, and he did it with a grain farmer's carrying voice. He would stand at his big frame house and catch the smell off Verren's place on the wind and remark that here was a man so low and so addled he had built himself a hovel on a horse-turd and called it a home. That Verren had moved into a manure pile and would come the spring thaw be found sickened and stinking in it. That a floor laid over a heap of dung would keep out a Dakota winter about as well as a wet blanket keeps out a bullet. And the men would laugh, and Crale would say, the good Lord gave a man logs and sod to build with, not a wagon load of stable muck to wallow in. It went around the country. Silas Verren, the man in the Dung-Heap Hovel, too low and too broke to build a proper house, who had moved into a manure pile and would sicken in the reek of it. Silas let them talk, because a laughing settlement is a settlement that leaves a man alone to work. And the work was long. When his heap was packed and capped and his plank floor laid, he turned to the parts that no one watching understood at all, because they were the parts that let the buried fire do its work and kept the reek of it out of the room. He laid his plank floor tight and close over the capped heap, close enough that the slow warmth rose steadily through the wood, but no foul air came up with it. And he set into the far corner of the lower chamber a small flue of his own devising that carried the gases of the rotting heap up and out above the roof, so the room stayed sweet while the heat came clean up through the floor. He banked the earth high around the whole structure so no frost could reach in from the sides to chill the heap, and hung a low door double, an outer leaf and an inner leaf with a still space between them so no draught could steal the risen warmth back out. He set a small iron stove against one wall for the bitterest nights, and laid in only a modest rank of dry wood beside it, nothing like the great cords the other men were splitting, for his design was built to run on the buried heap and to need the stove hardly at all. The men who watched him fuss over a floor laid on a manure pile were sure now that grief had finished what the fever began. Josiah Crale told it at the settlement that the stable hand had bedded himself down over a dung pile like a hog in a wallow and would rot along with it come the thaw, and folks rode past on Sundays just to look at the queer hovel where a fool had floored a room over a heap of manure. What they were looking at and could not see was the finest part of the whole design. Every honest dugout and every chinked cabin in that country would spend the winter bleeding its warmth out to the frost and the wind, and feeding a hungry stove day and night to make the lost heat back. Silas Verren's compost-heated room would do none of it. The deep buried heap would burn its slow, steady fire under the floor all winter, throwing a free heat up into the room that needed no wood and no tending, while the banked earth and the double door held that warmth in against the frost. He had buried a fire that fed itself and floored his life straight over the top of it, and left the winter nothing to freeze but the dead ground above. It was as complete a piece of cold country reasoning as the Territory had ever seen worked into a rise, and the whole of Harlow Bend rode past on Sundays to laugh at it. By the middle of November, the country began to turn hard, and Silas Verren got his first real proof, though he was near the only man who marked it. A savage cold snap came down off the plains one night, the first true one of the season, the temperature falling away to well below zero, and the wind out of the north driving the frost deep into everything it could reach. In the gray of the morning, the homesteaders up and down the bend woke to misery. The frost had crept into the bare dirt walls of the dugouts and the chinking of the cabins all night and stripped the warmth out, so their rooms were bitter cold though their stoves had been fed till midnight, and every family rose shivering to build the fire back up from cold ashes with fingers that would barely close. That was the plain price of a cold snap on the plains, and every homesteader in the Territory paid it. Silas Verren did not. He rose in his hovel and set a bare foot down out of his blankets onto the plank floor, and the floor was not cold. It was warm. Warm as a hearthstone banked overnight, the slow heat of the buried heap coming steady up through the wood. And his room was mild and easy, though his little stove had gone stone cold and dark hours before. He laid a bare palm flat against the planks, the thing a liveryman does by habit to feel the heat of a heap, and the warmth stood up into his hand, patient and steady and free. He did not smile much, Silas Verren, not since the winter the fever took his wife, but he smiled at that. His neighbors were building fires with frozen fingers in cold, dark rooms. His floor was warm and his stove was out. It was working. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a country who believes a true thing, and Silas Verren had lived in it all that summer, doubled now by the other loneliness he carried out of that hard cold week the winter before. On the clear nights of that late autumn, with the first proof behind him and the great test still ahead, he would sit in the warm hovel with his stove cold and dark, and go back over the whole of it in his mind, the way a man checks a sum he has staked his life on. There was no book for what he had built. He had only what he had learned with his own hands in a lifetime of stables and freight roads and steaming heaps, the plain remembered fact that a deep, packed, damp, sheltered heap of dung burns a slow, warm fire for months, and on the cold nights that fact was the only voice in the whole of Harlow Bend that agreed with him. Everyone he could speak to believed the loud and obvious thing, that a man keeps warm behind good logs and a roaring fire, and that Silas Verren had bedded down in a manure pile. The quiet thing about the buried heap and its slow, steady burn only he believed, and he had decided long before which of the two he would trust when they disagreed, and he trusted it now, and set his bare feet on the warm floor and slept easy while the frost cracked the ground outside. He told no one, because there was no one who would have believed him, and besides, Silas Verren did not need the settlement to agree with him before a thing was true. He dug a small, deep-bedded shelter into the bank beside the door for his team so the horses, too, might make and keep their own heat. Kept close by him the shaggy dog that had followed his wagon west and settled in to wait for the winter he had spent 6 months getting ready for. The Bend settled in, too, its woodpiles high, its opinion of Silas Verren fixed. He was the low, stable hand in the Dung-Heap Hovel who had moved into a manure pile, and when the first killing cold came, they expected. In the way people expect such things, without quite wishing them, to find him second or frozen in the filthy hole he had dug himself. The first killing cold came in the second week of December, and it did not come alone. It came as the front edge of the worst winter that country had seen in the memory of anyone living in it. A winter men in Dakota would still be measuring other winters against 40 years on. It began with a wind out of the northwest that dropped the temperature 50 degrees between noon and dark, and then it began to snow, and the snow did not stop. For 8 days the blizzard held the territory in its fist. The wind blew without pause, packing the snow into drifts that swallowed fences and buried the low sheds and cut Harlow Bend off from everything but its own hard endurance, and cattle drifted before the wind and died against the drift lines by the score. The thermometer nailed to the wall of the settlement store, which the storekeeper watched with a kind of horror, fell and did not come back. It passed 20 below. It passed 30 below. It passed 40, and then 50. On the 5th day of the storm, in the blue dark of a morning, when the wind seemed to reach down into the marrow of the world, the storekeeper wiped the frost from the glass and read it at 56 degrees below zero, and he had never in his life seen it there. And he did not tell the few who were about, because he did not think a number like that would help anyone bear it. 56 below. At such a cold, the ordinary rules of a frontier winter stopped applying, and a new and merciless arithmetic took over. Breath froze in a man's beard the instant it left him. Dry wood burned with a thin, hurrying flame that seemed to give no heat at all against a cold that vast. The homesteaders of Harlow Bend, who had built their honest chinked cabins and their plain bare dugouts like sensible people, found now what sensible people found in a winter like that one, that the frost at 56 below drove straight through every log chink and every dirt wall and stripped a room cold no matter how the stove roared, and that a fed fire had to be fed without pause or the cold took the room back in an hour. They kept their fires roaring and wore their coats indoors and watched their great wood piles shrink with a growing private fear, and the storm did not stop, and the thermometer did not rise, and the wood burned down. In the rise, in the queer Dung-Heap Hovel the whole country had laughed at. Silas Verren was warm. He was not roasting, the low room was not hot. But it was warm, steadily and quietly and unmistakably warm, and it stayed warm through the first day of the storm and the second and the third with no fire in the stove at all. For the buried heap beneath his floor was doing precisely the work he had built it to do, burning its slow, steady fire the way it had burned since summer, and throwing its patient heat up through the warm floor while the banked earth and a double door held it in against the frost that gripped the ground above. The frost that stripped the cabins of their heat could find no heat of Silas's to strip, for his warmth did not come off a fire in the room that the cold could beat down. It came up out of the buried earth from a fire the winter could not reach or touch or freeze. The storm gave him no reason to trust it, and every reason to doubt, and still the buried fire held. The wind found the open plain and threw itself at the banked rise without pause, a solid pouring roar that went on so long the ears stopped hearing it as sound. And the snow drove so deep over the low roof that it packed a thick white blanket over the whole hovel that only sealed the warmth in the better. Silas Verren went out twice a day into that killing white, through the little airlock of his double door, to see to his team in the deep-bedded bank shelter and break the drift back from the doorway. And each time the cold took the breath out of him like a blow and drove him back in within minutes, and each time he came back down onto a floor that was simply, quietly warm, the buried heap holding the room mild as steadily on the 5th day as it had on the 1st. He lit the stove once on the coldest night, more to cook and to see than for warmth, and let it go cold again. And the buried heap did the true work. He lay down at night with the dog on the warm planks beside him, and the storm screaming over the buried roof, and he was warm, and the cold could not get at the warmth, and hour after hour, day after day, the buried fire did not fail. He had a thermometer of his own, a small one he had carried out of the settled country and hung by the inner door. And on the 5th morning of the storm, the morning the store glass read 56 below, Silas Verren rose in the blue dark off the warm floor and looked at it. The needle inside his Dung-Heap Hovel stood at 42 degrees above zero. 42. Not warm as a summer parlor is warm, but warm as a good cellar is warm on a hard night. Warm enough that his hands were sure, and his water stood liquid in the pail, and his dog slept stretched flat on the warm plank floor with no thought of cold at all, his stove stone cold and unlit in the corner. 42 degrees inside, against 56 below outside, a gulf of near 100 degrees held across a floor of plank and a buried heap of dung, with no fire lit at all, in the worst blizzard the Territory had ever thrown. Silas Verren stood a while looking at the needle, and then he set the flat of his bare foot down on the warm planks the way he had that first frosty morning, and the buried heat came up steady into his soul, while astride above him the frozen crust of the plain stood at a cold that would kill a man in an hour. And he did not light the stove, and the room was warm, and it was working exactly as he had known 6 months before that it would. Up on the section line, the reckoning had come to Josiah Crale. Crale had cordwood, a great deal of it, and he had burned through the better part in 7 days of trying to hold his big frame house against the cold. For a great drafty house of milled lumber takes a great deal of feeding, and on the 8th day. With the storm still howling, and the wood run low, and his stove for the first time going gray and cold at its heart, the loud, broad-handed man who had led all the laughing understood that he was in real danger, and that the nearest help in that white and screaming world was in the Dung-Heap Hovel he had mocked. It cost him something to go. He waited until the cold in his own big rooms had a killing edge to it, and then he wrapped himself in every hide he owned and put his head down into the wind and fought his way down off the section line and across the buried flat to the stable hand's queer hovel, half frozen, not sure the man would even answer, not sure a man could even be alive in a hole folks said was mostly dung and grief. He beat on the outer door with a numb fist, and it opened, and he stepped down into the little space between the two doors, and then the inner door opened, and warmth rolled up out of the buried room into the storm like something solid. Crale stood in the low doorway and could not speak at first, and it was not only the cold that stopped his mouth. He stepped down onto the warm plank floor of Silas Verren's buried room and felt the warmth of it stand steady all around him, a living heat rising up through the very boards under his frozen boots, and he looked for the roaring stove that must be making it, and found instead a small iron stove standing stone, cold and dark and plainly unlit in the corner, no fire anywhere in the room at all. He set his own numb hand down flat on the warm planks and felt the heat come up steady out of the floor, and looked at the dog stretched flat asleep on the warm boards and at the little thermometer by the door reading 42 degrees while the world outside stood at 56 below. And Josiah Crale, grain farmer, owner of the big frame house, leader of all the mockery, understood at last what he had been laughing at all summer long. He was quiet a moment. Then he took off his frozen cap and said the only thing there was to say. "You buried a fire under the floor that never goes out," he said, slow, and it held. Silas Verren said that it had. Crale stood there a while longer with the thawing coming painful into his hands, and said, lower, that he had been a fool about the dung and about the man, and had said hard things he had no business saying. Silas Verren, who had no more gloating in him than he had left of grief to spare, only told him to shut the inner door and sit by the warm floor and stop letting the heat out. He kept Josiah Crale through the last days of the storm. And two others from the Bend, who came down the buried road behind Crale, once word of the warm hovel went round, and the small room built to hold one man and a dog held 4 men and a dog besides, and it stayed warm through all of it on almost no wood, because the heat was not in the stove, the heat was in the buried heap that burned its slow fire under the floor and never went out. When the wind finally broke on the 9th day, and the sun came up hard and blinding over a white and ruined country, the men who came up out of Silas Verren's hovel walked out warm and whole into a bend that had lost cattle and sheds and very nearly some of its people, and they did not laugh about the Dung-Heap Hovel any more. Josiah Crale least of all. He went home to his cold big frame house and his burned-out woodpile a changed man, and in the spring, quietly, he came down to the hovel and asked Silas Verren to show him how the heap was built and packed and floored over, and Silas Verren showed him. Word of the warm hovel got around the country the way the laughter once had, only slower and more careful. Men rode over that next summer to see the queer buried heap and the low room that had held 42, while the plain stood at 56 below with never a fire lit. And Silas Verren, who had never much minded being laughed at, did not much mind being asked either. And he showed them the deep pit and the packed heap of dung and wet bedding capped beneath the heavy plank floor, and told them the thing he had known since the first steaming heap he ever forked as a boy, that a deep, packed, damp, sheltered heap of dung burns a slow, warm fire for months and asks for nothing, and that a floor laid over such a fire will beat a foot of proud chinked log and a great roaring stove besides. A few built buried heaps like his. Most did not, because it was long, low, reeking work, and most men would rather split an honest cord of wood they could point to than move in over a heap of dung they had to take on faith. But the ones who built them blessed them. And the story of the winter of 1885, the winter of 56 below, when the low stable hand in the Dung-Heap Hovel stayed warm, and the men who laughed came knocking, was told in Harlow Bend for as long as there was a Harlow Bend to tell it. They had called him a fool for living on a heap of dung, while wiser men raised honest walls of log and sod, and in a way the wiser men had looked the wiser right up until the cold asked its real question. For a hard winter does not care how proud a wall stands or how high its woodpile is stacked. It asks only whether the idea will hold when the temperature falls far enough, and most ideas will not. Silas Verren had spent a whole summer answering that question before it was ever asked, burying a fire that needed no fuel under the floor he slept on and leaving the winter nothing to freeze but the dead ground above, and when the killing winter came and asked, his answer was already made. And it was warm, and it held. As the old liveryman used to say of the deep-bedded stall that steams warm through the hardest January, while the swept-clean yard lies frozen hard as iron, it is not the fire a man can see that warms him, but the one buried deep enough to burn all winter. Silas Verren had buried his fire the way he had banked 1,000 heaps in a stable yard. And on the morning it fell to 56 below, the slow, warm burn of it never once let the cold come in.